a couple of examples of miracles, and I thought, in the course of my life, I've personally witnessed three. Firsthand, I was alone. All three are in emergency situations. But the problem with telling you about a miracle that I witnessed is that if I were a skeptic sitting in the audience, I would think that Kirk up there at the front is either lying or he's exaggerating something to make it sound like a miracle, or maybe he's just, just not completely rational. Like Kirk's a little crazy and he sees things that aren't actually there, not real. So what should I do with regard to miracles? And there were three miracles I'd like to look at here, accounts of miracles that are presented by people who, the first two are not, is not a believer. He's not a Christian. Charles Templeton. Charles Templeton was a very prominent evangelist in the mid-1900s, and he was a mentor to Billy Graham, who became probably the most well-known evangelist in the world in the mid-1900s and he just passed away, I think, a few years ago. But Charles Templeton, early on, began to lose his faith. He just found disbelief growing in his heart to the point where he no longer believed in God. He no longer believed in the Bible. He abandoned Christianity. And afterwards, he wrote some memoirs. He wrote an autobiography. And he recounts two miracles. And they're in his, you can see it online. It's called an anecdotal memoir. But he recounts them as an agnostic, as a person who no longer believed in God or the supernatural. So I found it very odd and intriguing that he would include two accounts of miracles that he had personally witnessed. In the first account, he was in Toronto, and a mother had just begged him to come over and pray for her infant daughter. Her infant daughter had something went wrong in the gestation period, and the muscle down the right side of the neck became attached to the left shoulder, turning the child's neck permanently to the left, and what Templeton refers to as the jugular vein was interlaced with this muscle so that they could not operate on it, at least at that time. They could not operate to fix the child's neck. So the child was like this, and every once in a while they would take the brace off and try and stretch several times a day the child's muscles so that someday hopefully the child would be able to have some semblance of normalcy. The child was obviously disfigured when Templeton walked into the room. Obviously disfigured, cranked to the left. It was an infant at the time. He then put some oil on his fingertips because he read in the Bible, olive oil, but he totally did not believe anything was going to happen. He was well on his way to having lost faith in God and Christianity and the Bible, just for, I'm not sure a rational reason, but just this lack of belief anymore. And so he prayed for the child, put a little bit of oil on the child's head, prayed. But as he was praying, in his autobiography, he states that he was just really trying to think of some comforting words to give to the mother when he finished his prayer, because obviously nothing was going to happen. And he needed to comfort her and everything else. So he finished the prayer, and they sat down. The mother was holding the child and facing him, and they were talking. And Templeton, he began to say some encouraging things, and then he said to the mother, "Wasn't the child's head permanently to the left?" Because the child was looking to the right. And as Templeton said that, the child turned and looked at Templeton. The mother screamed, passed out. He caught the baby. And it was an obvious case to Templeton of an instantaneous healing, a restructuring of the neck. Restructuring of the neck during his prayer. The interesting thing about it, the fascinating thing in his autobiography is that he says he still denies God had anything to do with this, because he says, I had no faith, so obviously it wasn't God, but I don't see how that logically follows because there was the mother. But he just says, strange things happen sometimes. Strange things happen. And as a scientist, if I saw something like that, I wouldn't just say, oh, strange things happen sometimes. No, that is not possible. I would say that what we just witnessed here is not biologically or physically possible. You don't restructure a person's neck in a matter of seconds with just like that. It doesn't happen. So why I mention this is that 4 years later, a Canadian magazine at the time, which is now defunct, but it was kind of like Life magazine. It was a big pictorial magazine. They wanted to do a run, I think, on something to do with miracles, and they contacted Templeton. And he says, hey, why don't you check with the Children's Hospital in Toronto, track down this woman, because she might have something to say about this. And they did. And they featured an article on her, and they showed a photograph of this young girl, 4 years old now, manifestly normal. I quote that from his book, manifestly normal. Like, obviously, when he saw her first, she was obviously disfigured. Now she's manifestly normal, never had another problem as far as we could see from that article. That's case number one, and it comes from the pen of an agnostic, a very well-known at the time, famous, at least in North America, perhaps in Europe, agnostic. He has another miracle that he talks about as well that I'll use. His aunt became terminally ill with some sort of a stomach cancer, and they reached a point as she deteriorated where there was they could no longer do anything for her at the hospital. They sent her home for her final days just to pass away at home. The relatives begged him to come over and pray for the aunt, and of course by this time he had made any public statements about the loss of faith. He was still preaching and doing stuff like that, but personally he no longer believed. But he went over there, his aunt, again, feeling super awkward. Nothing's going to happen. It's just embarrassing. It's just going to put a lot of stress. But he laid his hands on the aunt and prayed for healing. And she had been bedridden for weeks. She's on her the home stretch here. Prayed for healing, and then he went home. And as he walked in his apartment, the phone was ringing. Picked it up. It's the aunt, the one he just prayed for. And she was crying. The other people said she's running around the apartment. She's feeling like $1 million. She's totally healed. And wow, that's something. But he goes on to write that she was permanently healed. It never came back, and she died 42 years later at the age of 87. And, keep in mind, Templeton, as an agnostic, if anyone was a skeptic at the time he wrote his memoirs, it was him. He's not exaggerating here. He's not kind of making stuff up. In fact, it kind of makes him look a little odd, maybe embarrassing as an agnostic to even admit that he's personally witnessed two things that are absolutely inexplicable from a scientific perspective. How this woman just instantaneously healed of terminal cancer after being bedridden for weeks. The third case, and it's just to illustrate another case of a miracle. This one is extra intriguing because it's in a peer-reviewed paper in a science journal. And this publisher, Elsevier, I always have a problem with this, Elsevier. They're a reputable publisher of science journals and academic journals. And this one, of course, they phrase it in typical scientific ways. Case report of instantaneous resolution of juvenile macular degeneration blindness after proximal intercessory prayer. And most of the article is really technical with, diagrams of retinas and all this kind of stuff. But what it is, it's a scientific investigation into what appeared to be, to the authors, this is extremely inexplicable. Now, they're not sharing the gospel in the paper. I don't even know if they're Christians, but they're just investigating this, kind of like the X-Files. They're investigating it. I'll just take a couple of quotes here from the paper. They're more, a lot of it's technical, but every once in a while you'll read something that I think the average person will have no problem understanding. It says, quote, regained her vision instantaneously after receiving PIP, that's personal intercessory prayer, that's their PIP from her husband. This experience occurred after approximately 13 years of blindness. The PIP was presented in a Christian tradition, it says, in a Christian tradition. So literally what happened is that she was going to bed, and they were both crying. And so the husband just decided to kneel down and pray for her. And she said, when he said amen, she could suddenly see him kneeling by the side of the bed. And in fact, in her words, they quote her in this article. This is the woman. They're quoting the woman here. What people need to understand is, I was blind, totally blind, and attended the school for the blind. I read Braille and walked with a white cane. Never had I seen my husband or my daughter's face. I was blind when my husband prayed for me. Then, just like that, in a moment, after years of darkness, I could see perfectly. So, I like peer review. I like when you find stuff in a peer-reviewed science journal, in a reputable journal, not one of those predatory ones, but in a good reputable journal that just says, hey, stuff happens here that, in fact, they say this is unique. This is the only case that they are aware of in history where something like this has happened with this kind of problem. So I wanted to start with this just to kind of soften you up to the possibility that miracles can actually occur. and I think I've thought about why is it that we don't hear more of these. They don't seem to be common all over the place all the time, but I think they are much more common than what we may realize. And I think back to my own self. I don't talk about the 3 miracles, and there's a 4th that involved my dad. I saw the before, the after a cow had stomped on his spine and splintered a vertebrae, and then he was, but that's another story. Why don't people talk about these things? And I know I don't talk about it because I have personally seen the disbelief on people's faces when I talk about them. I've been mocked I remember an atheist publicly mocking me when I shared an example of a miracle that I had witnessed once, as if I'm insane or a bald-faced liar. And so I think a lot of us, if we actually witness a miracle, we'll talk to people that we trust, we'll tell them what happened, but in public, we're not going to be calling the newspaper, might not even put it on social media. And so consequently, people aren't aware of just the number of miracles that do occur, at least within what the article refers to as the Christian tradition. Basically praying in the name of Jesus Christ, as happened in this case for healing. So with that in mind, I want to now look at how do we define a miracle? How do we define it? And I realized that there's really 2 different categories of definitions here. The first, or 2 types of miracles. The first one is an event that cannot be produced by the laws of physics. And physics ultimately rules the world. That's not actually completely true. God rules the world, but God wrote the software of the universe. He wrote the operating system of the universe. We call those things the laws of physics. And so physics actually rules chemistry, but chemistry is involved here. Physics rules biology. I'm not convinced it rules 100%. I think there's still something supernatural woven into life. The Bible seems to indicate that in Romans chapter 1, that God's eternal, invisible attributes, eternal power, and divine nature become clearly seen through what He has created. So there's something supernatural about creation, something in there, signature. But in general, God has designed the laws of physics or laws of nature to run nature. It says that in Job. And that's actually quite phenomenal because many scholars argue that Job is the oldest book in the Bible. Whether it is or not, I don't know, but many scholars argue that it is, at least that it describes events that are the earliest, well, not obviously Genesis is before Job, but I mean that the events in Job happened even around the time perhaps of Abraham. But in that book, it talks about the ordinances with which rule the heavens and the earth, the laws. So we have in one of the most ancient writings of humanity, written roughly 4,000 years ago, an acknowledgement that there are laws of nature that govern the way the world works. And as we get to know the laws of nature, there are certain things that become obvious to us. Like this definition here isn't just an event that we don't know, that we can't explain with the laws of physics. That's not what the definition says. It says they cannot be produced by the laws of physics. What that means is that it's not saying we don't know what did it, therefore this must be a miracle. Like, I had a really nice pair of Gore-Tex bib overalls, outdoor things, and I don't know where they went. I've been looking for them for a few years. I can't explain. I do not know why my overalls disappeared, but that doesn't mean this is a miracle that my overalls disappeared. Or your socks. I was near convinced that the disappearance of socks when I did laundry as a single man was a miracle. And eventually the only way to solve that, and this solved it, but it was the only way I could stop socks disappearing between the laundry room and my apartment when I went to university as a young man, was to carefully get it out and walk backwards, watching all the time. And that was the only way I stopped the disappearance of my socks. But that, again, is not a miracle. Just because you can't explain something doesn't make it a miracle. Where a miracle, where you begin to become highly suspicious this is a miracle, is based on not ignorance, but based on what you know. You say, no, this cannot happen. The law of conservation of energy here does not permit this to happen. For example, if we bring 2 fish and 5 small buns and feed 5,000 people with those and have 12 basketfuls left over, that is a miracle. That is like the law of conservation of energy. If you did your energy calculations and converted the mass into energy and all that kind of stuff, it just doesn't work. That can't happen under the laws of physics. You can't restructure a girl's neck in a matter of seconds with no medical equipment whatsoever. There were no scalpels involved, nothing. It just bang, wow. You can't, the laws of physics and biology and chemistry don't permit that kind of stuff. And when you see things happen where the laws, you're on the basis of knowledge, this can't happen, then you are witnessing what's probably a miracle. It's not on the basis of ignorance, it's on the basis of what you know. This can't happen. The second type is, I would refer to it as an event that appears as if it's natural, but in fact it's not. And this is the beauty of the complexity of nature. You can make tiny, tiny adjustments on certain things, and that releases, there's a cascade of exponentially occurring, increasing consequences that are so small, they're interacting and stuff, and the next thing you know, you've got a hurricane forming over the Gulf of Mexico or something. So one night I was laying in bed. Patty and I were laying, it was a summer evening, the bedroom window's open. It's a quiet night. We live in a rural area. And it was just so nice, it was just peaceful. And then I heard the faintest rustling of leaves outside from one of those night winds that are just like a breath, just enough to rustle the leaves. And there's something so soothing and so peaceful about that I just had to thank God, and I worshiped God. And then when I just for few seconds. And then I thought, wait a sec. How do I know God didn't do that as a call to worship? Because I could certainly explain that through pressure differentials from different air temperatures at night and stuff, and the air moved this way and the leaves rustled and whatever. But God could have rustled those leaves. He could have created right there on the spot some pressure differentials or moved some wind through the trees, just the lightest of breeze to rustle the leaves, knowing that Kirk over here is going to really like that, and he's going to and we'll just get closer together in our relationship. How do I know? And I realize I can't tell that because nature, the processes of nature, all the little things on a day-to-day basis are so complex that God could be working all over the place and you'd never know it. It's kind of like Disneyland. If you've ever seen one of those documentaries of Disneyland where you've got whatever all the tourists see, and then there's all the tunnels and secret doors and everything else where all the staff run around and appear here and go there and make stuff happen. And there's a whole nother world underneath Disneyland. And it's the same with this world, that the nature is so complex that God could do all sorts of things, and you would just think, oh, that was just a pressure differential due to different temperatures of air over between the river and the valley here. I explained it. And it might not be. See, we just don't know. And so that's the second category of miracle, and I suspect a lot of that goes on in this world for God's purposes. So those are the two definitions. Now, let's move on into the supernatural foundation for miracles in this world, in the physical world. Is there a foundation? And this is going to be involving a little bit more thinking, but not heavy-duty stuff. It might be new stuff, but it's not heavy-duty. So there's a painting over here, and imagine that nature is represented by the woman in the painting to the right. So that represents nature, that woman right there. She represents nature. And let's say that the scientists make up a rule that everything must be brought into existence by that woman right there. No other explanations are allowed. Everything is brought into existence, and everything is caused by and can be explained by that woman right there. Okay, well, everybody's happy about that and fine until they discover that the woman was born 30 years ago. Now that creates a problem, and the problem is, if the woman is the cause of everything and she was born 30 years ago, then what gave birth to the woman? Could the woman have given birth to herself? That's logically impossible. It violates a principle called the law of non-contradiction and creates something known as a circular fallacy. The woman could not give birth to herself. But if the woman is the one, if the rule says the woman must have caused everything and has brought everything into existence, but she had a beginning herself 30 years ago, that creates a problem. And that illustrates where we stand with nature. Science has made up a rule, and it's not really science, it's scientists, a certain philosophy of science that has made up a rule that everything has a natural explanation, and no other explanation is allowed, okay? If you want to be respectable in the field of science. But the problem is that science has found out that nature had a beginning. And that's a whole seminar in itself. How do we know nature had a beginning? But there's two ways to look at it. You can look at the scientific evidence that nature had a beginning, which is a lot what the cosmologists do. You look at the scientific evidence, and no matter whether you're going with a one-shot, one-off deal that this universe is, or you can go with an oscillating universe, or you can go with a multiverse. In all three major scenarios, you are forced to come to a beginning. Even in a multiverse, there has to be a beginning to the multiverse. Mathematically, you can prove, if there's time involved, you can prove that the past is finite, whether it's a multiverse, oscillating universe, or a one-shot deal. Now, all you need to know is that there is no way out. It's checkmate. Nature had a beginning, at least from a mathematical point of view. It brings you to checkmate on that one. So that creates the same problem. Well, if nature has to explain everything, and nature is what brought everything, it makes everything else happen, but nature itself had a beginning, well then what brought nature into existence? Well, this is a key statement right here, so just focus on it. It is logically impossible to provide a natural explanation for the origin of nature without assuming the existence of nature in your natural explanation. But we're trying to explain how nature came into existence. So you can't start with the existence of nature bringing itself into existence. We're running to a dead end here. There's a problem. It's logically impossible for nature to have brought itself into existence. There is no natural explanation for the origin of nature. So logic dictates, therefore, that the cause of nature cannot be natural. It has to be non-natural or supernatural. This is just cold, hard logic. It's not a verse from the Bible or some religious doctrine that people recite or a statement of faith. It's just cold, hard logic that the cause of nature cannot be natural. So let's summarize this in a concise way. So we're faced with two options here. The cause of nature, what brought nature into existence, or that woman in the painting, if you want to think of it that way, what brought nature into existence, there's only two options here. It's either natural or it's not natural. And we have a phrase for not natural. It's called supernatural. So those are the two choices. There's no middle ground here. This is what's known as a true dichotomy. It's either natural or not natural, natural or supernatural. But just as a woman cannot give birth to herself, so nature cannot have brought itself into existence. So that eliminates the natural explanation, the natural option. Now, when you only have two options, and one of those options is logically impossible, then the other option, no matter how awkward it might be, has to be the solution. Therefore, it logically follows that the cause of nature is itself supernatural. And that is, I just love this. It's just beautiful. It's a very elegant, simple, concise way. I've done many lectures at many universities across the country on this very thing. And people keep thinking I got something up my sleeve, or this can't be, It's like playing with a chess master, and all of a sudden you find yourself in checkmate in about 3 moves, and you think he cheated. This can't be. Can't be. I can't be in checkmate so soon. Now, there are responses, and this is where another seminar would go into those responses, but all of them fail. This is the beauty of just pure logic sometimes, is that it really cuts through all the fog and the feelings and what we want to believe and everything else, and you get right down to this. Of course, that leaves the question, well then, what caused the supernatural cause? But if you have a cause that's timeless, it's logically impossible for that timeless being to have itself a beginning and therefore a cause. And remember the problem with the woman in the picture only arose when we found out she had just come into existence 30 years ago. But if the woman had always existed in a timeless state, where it doesn't violate other principles in infinite set theory, she would, then there's no need to come up with a cause for the woman, because the woman has always existed. But in this case, we call it God. We call him God, the origin of the universe. The supernatural cause of nature is God, and God is a being that seems to transcend time. It's not dependent upon time. Time comes from God. He is the creator of time and space and matter and energy. And therefore, this being here exists in a timeless state where there is no the causal chains end there. We come to the end of the causal chains. Now, what does all this mean? Massive implication. Massive. I do not see how atheism can survive in the face of this implication. At least rationally survive. Implication number one, the physical world has a supernatural origin and foundation. That is, physical reality has a foundation, and it's not physical reality. It is a supernatural. There is something bigger out there within which physical reality was able to come into existence and exists. And it's not just the origin of the physical reality. The physical world has a foundation upon which it stands, and that foundation is supernatural. And then arises the second implication. If the very foundation of physical reality is, in fact, supernatural, then it should be very surprising indeed if miracles never occurred. Rather, we should not be surprised. We should expect that from time to time that supernatural foundation of physical reality is going to become observable in the physical world in different ways. How often? We don't know, but we should expect that we will observe this from time to time. We should certainly say it would be irrational to just arbitrarily assert that we will never observe miracles or the supernatural doesn't exist, especially in the face of this logical argument here. There are objections. You could, again, spend a whole seminar on David Hume's objections, and I will apologize in advance to David Hume for the rather trivial summary of his arguments or his conclusions that I'm giving here. But I think what I want to provide to you is at least a starting point on how to start to respond. So he had 2 objections to miracles, 2 common, well-known ones. First of all, he defined a miracle as a, quote, violation of the laws of nature. That was his words. He used the word violation there, laws of nature. Objection number 1 is God cannot violate a law. So therefore, miracles can't occur. Objection number 2, we have no justification to believing a miracle has occurred. And he goes on into that, and this is where I want to apologize, because I'm not really giving you the arguments that he presents in favor of this. I just want to present his 2 conclusions here. But if you look at those 2 conclusions, there are responses, at least the first step, and that's all I want to supply you with here, is just, well, what do you say to that? Well, first of all, I would say using the word violation, that's a problem. That kind of frames the witness in the stand here. Like, when did you stop beating your wife? Have you stopped beating your wife? Or have you stopped watching online porn? If you say yes, then that implies you were measure into it before, or if you say no, well, you're in an awkward position here. It frames the question in such a way that it puts you in a situation where you can't really accurately respond. And that's when you have to, and when somebody says answer the question yes or no, you ought to be suspicious about that, because you might be, maybe this is a false dichotomy here. But in this case, the word violation is a problem. It's the laws of nature are not really a moral code. They're not moral. They're more analogous to a computer program that is designed in such a way that the writer of the program or the user of the program can intervene. For example, interactive games. Just yesterday, I've been working with a team of scientists in the US, writing some software to analyze amino acid sequences. And little alignments that are sometimes tens of thousands of sequences, that contain tens of thousands of sequences, looks for patterns. And sometimes we know that those patterns are going to be very difficult to find. They're usually pretty obvious, the small patterns, but the big ones that can really get into it, and your program will just keep going. And stuff is going off the rails, and so we've designed the program so that the person can intervene. You can just keep a hands-off approach and let that thing run until the cows come home. But no, we've got other things to do, and the computer has other things to do, and so you can just click on the stop button, and you can stop that program from continuing on. So the program has been written so that it'll function out perfectly fine on its own, but if you want to intervene, it's also designed for that. And this is the way we should more properly see the laws of nature. They're kind of like the operating system of the universe. But it's just a flat-out assumption that nobody can intervene with these. Why would God do this? I mean, he could if he wanted to, but he also could design the software for the universe that he could intervene and so forth. So I think Hume's objection that's a violation sort of depends more on a moral view of laws, and God doesn't do morally wrong, therefore he can't violate these things. But they're not moral laws. They're just more like a computer program that governs how space-time, matter, and energy interact. Third, God is the programmer of the universe, and he's designed it such that he can intervene at any time. That's basically the conclusion of that. Now, with regard to Hume's other objection that there's no rational justification, well, Hume starts with looking at how nature, the regularity of nature, and miracles are not that, but that's not where I think we should start. I think where we should start is, well, where did nature come from in the first place? And we just looked at that. And what we see there is the justification for believing that miracles can occur is there when you realize that the foundation of physical reality is supernatural. Everything changes. All bets are off. Whole new ball game once you realize that the foundation of nature is actually supernatural. So I think that would be my two quick responses to Hume's arguments, his conclusions. Now, what about science? A lot of people, I hear a lot of objections from science. Miracles are not scientifically repeatable and testable, would be one objection. We can't, okay, well, do a miracle, we'll analyze it, whatever this. No, they're not just repeatable and testable like this. But that problem is actually not a problem. It assumes scientism, what's called scientism. And scientism is defined as the belief that science explains everything. And the only explanations allowed are scientific. It's like the rule about that woman there. Only that woman in the picture can make things happen and bring things into existence. But who made up the rule? That's problem number one. It assumes that science must explain everything and is the only explanation for everything. And that itself, that rule is not scientifically testable. And while you could say, well, let's do a miracle. Ooh, a miracle occurred, so therefore we falsified that. But what the response normally is no, that can't be a miracle because we've already granted as true the rule that everything must be explained by science. But by definition, a miracle is an event that was not caused by the regular, consistent, natural laws. So science is totally the wrong tool to make miracles happen or to reproduce miracles. If science could reproduce a miracle, then it's not a miracle. At least that event that it reproduced is not a miracle. Now, as I said before, you can have stuff occur that looks natural but was actually not. That could be reproduced later on. Another event to the same event could be reproduced by science, but not that one. But of course, we have no way of detecting those kind of miracles, but we do the ones that are blatantly on the basis of what we know that cannot happen. The regular, consistent laws of nature, however, are what enable us to identify miracles. We can see, oh, wait a sec, that's not just an anomaly over here. That is a bald-faced, not possible type of event under the laws of nature. Therefore, we have to have a category or a name to describe these things. We call those things miracles. The role of science, however, there is a role for science and miracles, and that is exactly what you see in that journal article that I referred to earlier. The role of science is to study and document miracles. And that's what they've done in that journal paper. And investigate it. And so forth. The science does have a role, and it's handy to do. I want to go back now to another little area of miracles, and I've seen it on the web. Why doesn't God heal amputees? And okay, you say God exists, does miracles. Okay, let's bring an amputee up here. Okay, there you go. Why doesn't God heal that guy? And, you know, it's helpful to know that miracles just don't seem to be something, and I don't know why this is. Jesus says if you had faith as a mustard seed, you could say to this tree, be uprooted over here and planted there, and I would just love that for landscaping potential. And it is kind of humbling. It is kind of humbling. I've always asked myself, you know, how strong is my faith? If you think your faith is strong, we'll just try moving a couple of trees around, and then maybe that'll put you back in that'll do away with some pride that might be creeping in there. And I always wonder about these things, and I think back to the 3 miracles I saw that I actually witnessed the day I was in, and they were all in emergency situations where I had seconds and 2 of them I had, God help me, and that's all I had time for. And it was a sense of urgency. It's not like, well, I think I'd like to see a miracle happen today, let's try this. You know, it wasn't like that at all. It was a whole different charged situation. It was very charged. And the other one, there wasn't even time to yell, God help me, and God intervened and saved my life. And it was just a blatant, like, physics didn't do this. The physics could not have done this. But anyways, I don't seem to be able to I wished I could. You know, there's so many people. I've spoken debates on the existence of God. I've defended God's existence, and I remember there was a person in a wheelchair right there. And I just wished I could say, okay, now for my third argument, in the name of Jesus Christ, stand up, you are healed. And I often talk to God about that. You know, why, you know, I want faith. I want my faith to grow. But I have seen miracles, and I think we're to expect them. But the reality is when you look at the scriptures, periods of miracles are rare, where you see a lot of miracles happening. So here's a chart, and all these pink bars here represent an extended period of miraculous events, and they're actually pretty thin. They're pretty thin here. You got creation, the origin of the universe, and the origin of life. Then there's 1,600 years roughly between Adam and the flood. And there's basically no miracles, at least none are recorded. And then you have the flood, and the Bible, there's clearly miraculous events occurring there that could not be reproduced by science. And you get a lot of scientists, clear consensus scientists, no, we can't do this ain't happening, whatever. So there was obviously some miraculous events there. And then you got another 1,000 years of no miracles, well, no extended periods of miraculous events. And then you have the Exodus, and you got a pile of miracles in a space of about 40 years. But that 40 years is a pretty thin bar there. And then you got another 500, and then you got about 70 years of Elisha and Elijah. And there seemed to be a lot of miracles during that point. So that's why that bar is a bit thicker. Then there was Christ and the apostles, and again you had maybe 50 years roughly of Christ and the apostles working, extended period of miraculous events. And so that bar is a little thicker. And now it's been 2,000 years with no extended period of miraculous events. Now, I certainly hear of miracles around the world, particularly in developing countries. It's interesting that Jesus says he could not do many miracles in Capernaum because of their unbelief. And the unbelief of our Western culture here, I think, is a major factor why we don't see more miracles, at least on a large scale. we certainly do see them on an individual scale. So what I'm pointing out here is that periods of frequent public miracles, even in the Bible, are the exception rather than the norm. Yet, the Bible clearly leads us, we should expect them, and that's something to talk to God about. But it's not like you're just not going to have a big outpouring of miraculous events on a regular basis for an extended period of time, it seems, until the last days. That's going to be the last one, and then you will see there'll be no more atheists in the final days, the great period of the Great Tribulation leading up to Armageddon. Everybody will know there's a God, but strangely they will say, we don't want God. I want to close with a literal miracle of rational thinking. This is simple, but so hard to wrap your mind around. And here goes. Rational thinking is where you arrive at a conclusion by thinking through a series of premises to arrive at what you believe to be true. So you might say, well, if A is the case, and if A leads to B, and we have A as the case, then B must be true. And somebody asks you, why did you come to this conclusion? You're going to say, well, because if A is the case, we got to hear what's called a conditional statement. And this conditional statement and the antecedent here is true, therefore the consequent must logically follow, and therefore this is the conclusion. That would be your explanation. Under naturalism, however, a conclusion is actually just a chemical state of the brain, and it's 100% determined by chemistry and physics, has nothing to do with the rules of logic. Nothing. And so you can't say, oh, you're wrong. No, your brain state may not sync with somebody else's chemical brain state, but the idea of truth and false, that's just ridiculous. So consider the question, is it true that it's wrong to lie? Just consider that question. You probably have some sort of an answer. You might have a simple answer, either yes or no, or you may have a more complex answer as well, maybe, whatever. But anyways, you've got an answer. I'm not so much interested in your answer, but how do you explain your answer? So, the correct answer to give, if there is no supernatural aspect to the world, there are no miracles, and everything is 100% determined by physics, the correct answer is, well, and somebody asked, why did you believe this? You would begin to write on the blackboard a ton of physics and chemistry equations. It would be like, because you have to explain the chemical state of this chunk of organic matter between your ears, that outputted this thing saying yes or no or some other more complex answer. And it would be 100% explained by physics and chemistry. You would not say, well, there's some moral laws out there and this and that. No. We're not. The laws of nature are not interested in moral laws. Everything, if nature does everything, and there is no God, there's no supernatural, everything is 100% determined by physics. So forget that explanation. I want to see a ton of equations here to explain how you arrived at your conclusion. But even that's awkward, because the moment the person says, I want an explanation, you could say, well, what sort of brain state are you in? Like, tell me, what sort of chemistry and whatever led you to ask that question? And then they would say, well, why do you ask this question? Because what sort of chemical brains? It just dissolves into absurdity. You don't see stuff like that going on in nature. Everything is nice and smooth and simple if it's just controlled by physics and chemistry. You don't see arguments happening. Rational explanation, however, is your conclusion is based on actually thinking through a series of premises, using rules of logic, not rules of chemistry. It's not a result of a chemical reaction. In fact, in order to practice rational thinking, you must be able to perform a feat that is not determined by chemistry and physics. You must be able to unattach your mind from the laws of physics and chemistry such that you can actually run on the rules and the axioms of logic and figure out your answer that way, rather than having it's what I ate for breakfast in the gravitational field, and somebody gave me a cattle prod in the rear end, and I came under with this answer. So that's the difference, and I hope that this is so obvious but so novel that you might have to think about it for a little bit. The laws of nature care nothing for what's true or false. They simply produce chemical and physical effects. That's what the laws of nature do. Yet we actually care about whether our beliefs are true or false. And in order to determine whether a chemical state of your brain is true or false, you might need to consult somebody else. Often you're aware of it yourself. I know my mother-in-law, when she was entering a state of dementia, went through an extended phase where the brain is just not working. Like it's just not working, but she knows it's not working. And she would express frustration, oh, I'm stupid, I'm stupid. Somehow the mind interfaces with the brain, and the brain is affected. The brain does run, I think, a lot, mostly, maybe all, on physics and chemistry. But it has something that interfaces with it to interact with it. That's the mind. The mind is different from the brain, and the mind interfaces with the brain. If you had no mind and you just had a brain that ran on physics and chemistry, then every explanation to every answer you ever gave would be entirely, you wouldn't say because it's the right thing to do. That's what a bogus answer that would be if your brain just runs on chemistry and physics, and that's how answers were justified. So C.S. Lewis brings this out in detail in his book, Miracles, in the first couple of chapters. Since a chemical reaction care nothing for what is true or false, we cannot arrive at a true rational conclusion if the conclusions are actually completely determined by chemistry and physics. And you can tell, there's stuff you can inject in your brain or take in your arm, and you're coming up with conclusions that are not true. Just say LSD, for example. I've not done LSD, just to make that clear, but I've heard a lot about it, especially growing up in the 60s and 70s. And people we would say, you're not thinking straight. And what do we mean by that? You're not following rules of logic here. What you're experiencing is a complete physical, chemical brain state here. And that's not good. And we all know it's not good when you just start going with what your physical chemistry state of the brain says. We need to be able to somehow assess whether our brains are working properly. And the moment you start doing that, you've entered a whole nother level of operating on principles of logic and rational thinking that don't have any physical manifestations. They're not made of space, time, matter, and energy, yet we think on these things and we can determine truth and falsity. Bottom line, if the human mind can arrive at true, rational conclusions, and if it can make moral decisions that are true, then it is capable of doing something that cannot be reproduced by the laws of nature. It is a genuine, real-life miracle, a supernatural feat. And all of you have performed this supernatural feat many times already this morning since you got up, if you were thinking about anything at all. And I'm sure you were because you're here. So there we go. C.S. Lewis has a nice statement here. He says, the supernatural is not remote and abstruse. It is a matter of daily and hourly experience as intimate as breathing. That's why it's so difficult. People can't see the forest for the trees. You're in it. You're in the supernatural the moment you start thinking. You're performing feats. This is why some people, this is a whole nother, let's quit. Conclusions. And I want some Q&A here. Conclusions. There are cases of actual miracles that come from well-documented, credible sources. We saw those, either agnostic sources or that journal article. Conclusion number 2, just as a woman cannot give birth to herself, so nature cannot give birth to itself. Third, since the origin and foundation of nature and physical reality must be supernatural, we should not be in the least surprised if miracles happening. In fact, we should expect them. Fourth, the ability to think rationally and arrive at true decisions and even worry about what's true is an everyday but legit example of a miraculous event. 5, the track record of the Bible indicates extended periods of miraculous events are the exception, not the norm, but it also leads us to believe that we should expect them and ask God for them even. I'll close there. There's my website. From there you can get links to my YouTube channel and so forth.